we're taking a look at finding x and y intercepts for equations. The x-intercept is when y is equal to 0. It's also the place where the graph, if you have a graph, crosses the x-axis. The y-intercept is when x is equal to 0. It's also the place where, if you're looking at a graph, the line crosses the y-axis. The y-intercept is an important place for us when we get into y equals mx plus b slope-intercept form. That y-intercept is represented by the b portion of this equation, but it also algebraically is when x is equal to 0. So let's take a look at some pieces of that. Here's the part A. When y equals 3x minus 6, the y-intercept is that negative 6. But let's go through the algebra behind it so that we can see what happens in the other two equations for this. So let's start off with that y-intercept. The y-intercept is when x is equal to 0. And so I'm going to take y equals 3, and I'm going to plug a 0 in for x. Well, 3 times 0 is 0. 0 minus 6 is negative 6. So I get the point that y is equal to negative 6, where x is equal to 0, and y is negative 6. So the y-intercept is 0, comma, negative 6. Now let's take a look at the x-intercept. The x-intercept is when y is equal to 0. When y is equal to 0, so I'm actually going to set it equal to 0. And then I need to solve, so I have to do a nice friendly equation here, add 6 to both sides. And I end up with x is equal to 2. I want to put that in a point. X is 2 when y is 0. There's my x-intercept. Follow along with that same logic for the next one. We want to find the y-intercept. The y-intercept is when x is equal to 0, so I get y equals 100 minus 0 squared. Well, 0 squared is 0. 100 minus 0 is 100. So I get the point when x is 0, I get a y-intercept of 100. And then the x-intercept is when y is equal to 0, so I set it equal to 0. Go through and solve. Get the x squared by itself by subtracting 100 from both sides. There's a lazy 1 in front of that, so I can divide by negative 1. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of 100 is a nice number, so I end up with x equals 10. When I do that square root, I get a plus and a minus, and so I have to account for that plus and minus. Okay. X-intercepts are the same thing as x-roots, or solutions to an equation when we're looking at them before. So now I have back to that fundamental theorem of algebra, I've got an x squared, which means I should have 2 answers, which means I should have 2 solutions to this. Okay. Kind of follows along the same path. The difference is that we're looking at it in 2D instead of 1D. So we've got y equals something instead of just a plain number equals something. And so you can kind of think along those same lines, though, that if I've got a squared in here, there's a chance that somewhere along the line I'm going to have 2 answers. And here's where that happens. So the x-intercepts are at 10, comma 0, and also at negative 10, comma 0. And the y-intercept for the last one, again, where x is equal to 0. In this case, 0 minus 7, I've got y squared equals negative 7. Take the square root, and I've got y equals the square root of negative 7. Okay. There's 2 different schools of thought on this. The first one is that we can look at this and say, well, y equals square root of negative 7. We're taking the square root of a negative, and so there are no real answers. So you could put that there are no real answers. But you also could take this one step farther, and since we're already done with Algebra 2, and this is a review of Algebra 2, we know that when I have a negative underneath that square root, not only do I get the plus and the minus that I forgot at the top one, that not only do I get that plus and minus, But I also get, let me rewrite this, I also get with that negative underneath there, I get plus and minus the square root of 7. That negative actually stands for an imaginary number, or a complex number, so I get plus and minus the square root of 7i. Which means that my y-intercepts are when x is equal to 0 at the square root of 7i, and when x is equal to 0 at negative square root of 7i. And finally, the x-intercept when y is equal to 0, so I get 0 squared equals x minus 7. 0 squared is 0. So nice, easy equation. Add 7 to both sides. And x is equal to 7. I get the x-intercept of x equals 7 when y is equal to 0. Finding x and y intercepts of equations, we're doing these not on a graph, but we're doing them algebraically.